Hello, friends, and welcome to the Architecture Enthusiast. What is architecture? Lessons from a Restless Genius. A personal reflection on the lifelong quest of Frank Gehry. I still remember the first time I heard Frank Gehry speak. It wasn't in a lecture hall or a documentary. It was a scratchy YouTube interview someone had shared in a late-night architecture forum. He sat slouched, sleeves rolled, hair like a white firework of defiance, and he said, with equal parts mischief and exhaustion, "I don't know what architecture is. I'm still trying to figure it out." That sentence stopped me in my tracks. I had just spent the better part of a year pretending I did know. I had drawn clean lines on overworked plans, modeled forms that pleased my professors, and justified every move with citations and critical theory. But what I hadn't done, what I was too afraid to do, was admit that I was still lost. It was Gehry's honesty, not his buildings, that cracked something open for me. He didn't speak about architecture like a conqueror describing territory he had mastered. He spoke like a man still chasing a ghost through an unfamiliar forest, half haunted, half in love. That was my first lesson from him, that not knowing can be a form of wisdom. There's something terrifying about not having a fixed definition for the very thing you've devoted your life to. It's like being a chef who can't explain taste, or a poet who's unsure what words are for. And yet, Gehry thrived in that unknowing. He made me realize that the question is the practice. Asking what is architecture wasn't something you solved and moved on from. It was a question you returned to every morning, like a ritual. It was an invitation to remain open, to be porous, to resist the flattening certainty that kills the soul of the work. Over time, I saw how he carried that question, not like a burden, but like a compass, not one that pointed north, but one that spun wildly, reminding him that there were always more directions to explore. I began to carry my own version of that compass. I stopped pretending I had all the answers in front of clients or juries. I let myself say, "I don't know, yet." I learned that humility, when earned, can be more powerful than confidence. One of the hardest things to unlearn in architecture school is the myth of mastery, that if you learn the tools, absorb the canon, mimic the legends, you will become one. But Gehry dismantled that myth in the most unexpected way, by being relentlessly, unapologetically himself. He didn't try to speak the language of architecture as it was handed down to him. He rewrote the grammar. That taught me the second lesson. Style is a consequence, not a goal. For years I tried to find my voice in architecture by choosing an aesthetic. Clean lines, minimal details, sober palettes, like so many others. But it all felt like a costume. Then I realized Gehry didn't invent himself by seeking originality. He found it by being honest about his impulses, about what moved him, what confused him, what made him laugh. Architecture was an act of self-interrogation, not self-branding. It's a strange kind of rebellion, to listen to yourself more than you listen to the chorus of critics or peers. But that's where truth lives. And truth, I began to suspect, was Gehry's real medium, not steel, not glass, not titanium. There's also a deep loneliness in his work, not the melancholy of solitude, but the ache of being slightly out of step with the world. I used to think innovation came from a place of excitement, of progress. But with Gehry, I saw how radical creativity can be born of frustration. Frustration with the limits of convention, with the flatness of expectation, with the deadness that creeps in when form becomes formula. In this, Gehry gave me another lesson. Discomfort is fertile ground. When I feel most restless, when I look at a project and something in me winces, that's when I know I'm close to something worth pursuing. He taught me that you don't escape the cage by breaking through it. You melt it, reshape it, make it irrelevant. People often say Gehry's work is sculptural, and they mean it as praise or criticism. But to me, that misses the point. It's not about the form, it's about the freedom behind the form. He taught me that architecture isn't just about making things, it's about making meaning out of material. You have to pull something intangible through yourself and translate it into something the world can touch. And that translation will always be imperfect. That's what makes it human. So many of us are taught to eliminate imperfection, to erase the errant line, hide the seam, smooth the wrinkle. But Gehry invited those imperfections in like old friends. He saw them not as flaws, but fingerprints. From him, I learned that buildings don't have to be perfect to be alive. I think one of the most powerful things I learned from Gehry is that architecture is as much about feeling as it is about thinking. That's heresy in some circles. Emotion is considered subjective, unstable, untrustworthy, but Gehry trusted it more than reason. He followed his feelings like a trail of breadcrumbs, letting intuition guide him where logic couldn't. That helped me quiet the inner critic that always demanded justification. That voice that said, "Why are you doing this?" when what I really needed to hear was, "Keep going." Now, when I design, I listen for that flicker of feeling in my chest, the little jolt that says, "This means something," even if I can't explain it yet. Another lesson: risk is the soul of invention. Gehry took risks, not just aesthetic ones, but emotional, financial, professional. He built things that made people angry. He made choices that others called foolish. But he understood something most of us forget. Fear is a compass pointing to what matters. The times I've taken the biggest risks in my career, turning down a lucrative but soulless commission, proposing an idea that felt too strange for a client's taste, exposing my own uncertainty in a room full of supposed experts. Those were the times I felt closest to architecture as Gehry practiced it. Not the safe version, the real one. Most of all, I think Gehry taught me that architecture is a lifelong conversation. It's a conversation with the world, with space, with time, but also with yourself. And like all honest conversations, it involves contradiction, confusion, revelation, silence. Gehry never stopped asking what architecture could be. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew that to define it was to kill it. He allowed it to remain wild. That, to me, is the truest lesson of all. Architecture is not a fixed thing. It's a living question. The myth of arrival. Somewhere around my 5th year in practice, I caught myself saying something dangerous. I think I finally get it. I was at a dinner with colleagues, glowing with the temporary satisfaction of a project that had gone unusually well. It was a rare moment where the client, the budget, and the vision all aligned. For a brief moment, I felt what I'd long been chasing: validation, maybe, control, that seductive illusion of having arrived. But the next morning, sitting at my desk, I felt hollow. Not disappointed exactly, just done. Like a puzzle had been solved, and there was nothing left to assemble. And that, I realized with a jolt, was the death of my curiosity. That's when Gehry's words came back to me. "I don't know what architecture is," like a whisper I'd forgotten how to hear. It reminded me that the second you think you figured it out, you've stopped practicing it. From Gehry, I learned that arrival is a trap. That's not to say you shouldn't pursue clarity or excellence, but if your goal is certainty, you're not designing anymore, you're decorating a belief system. Real architecture, I've come to see, is a state of becoming. Not a place you reach, but a condition you inhabit. Uncertainty is a studio partner. The problem is, we're taught to fear uncertainty. We equate it with failure, or worse, incompetence. When I was younger, I saw doubt as a crack in the foundation of my skill set. But the older I get, the more I see it as a doorway. Gehry walked through that doorway every day. He didn't see uncertainty as a flaw in the process. He saw it as the process. He knew that ambiguity is where architecture becomes personal. It's in that murky space between intention and accident, between theory and material, that something genuinely original emerges. I've had moments like that too. The model that refused to behave, the sketch that wouldn't resolve, the idea that haunted me for weeks without a name. Those moments used to feel like failure. Now I recognize them as invitations. Gehry showed me that uncertainty is not the opposite of vision, it's the birth of it. The ugly, the awkward, the alive. There's something wonderfully brave about how Gehry never tried to make things traditionally beautiful. He wasn't chasing elegance or symmetry or even harmony in the conventional sense. What he chased instead was something harder to name, a kind of raw aliveness. That gave me permission to ask a forbidden question. What if architecture doesn't have to be pretty? What if it can be awkward or unruly, or even ugly in the way truth is sometimes ugly? There's a kind of honesty in that, a willingness to let things be what they are, rather than what others expect them to be. Gehry didn't tidy his ideas for public approval. He followed them into strange corners and sharp angles and didn't smooth them out for comfort. That taught me something enormous. Beauty isn't the goal. Presence is. If people walk into a space and feel something they didn't expect, that's worth more than 1,000 polished renderings. If a form wakes someone up instead of lulling them into aesthetic sedation, that's architecture doing its real work. Child's mind, builder's hands. One of my favorite things Gehry ever said was that he kept the child inside him alive, not in a nostalgic way, but as an operating principle. That child, curious, messy, fearless, was always at the table with him. I didn't let my inner child speak for a long time. He had been disciplined out of me by deadlines, standards, and fear of ridicule. But Gehry showed me that play is not a distraction, it's a design tool. He made space for wonder. He doodled. He let ideas misbehave. He asked questions no one else was asking because he wasn't afraid of being seen as unserious. And in doing so, he made the most serious kind of contribution you can make. He changed the way we think about space. I've started inviting that child back into my own process. I let him scribble over my neat diagrams. I let him ask, what if it flew, even when it shouldn't? I let him laugh at my too serious schemes, and slowly the work breathes again. Failure as fertilizer. You don't hear much about Gehry's failures, but if you look closely, you see that failure was embedded in his process. He courted it. He welcomed it. He didn't always know where he was going, and not every idea landed, but that didn't stop him from trying. That helped me reframe my own history of mistakes, not as evidence of weakness, but as a garden of necessary compost. The sketch that led nowhere, the pitch that fell flat, the internship where I designed bathrooms for 6 months straight. All of it was part of the slow, strange unfolding of becoming. You can't avoid failure, but you can change how you listen to it. Legacy as a question, not an answer. It's tempting to think of Gehry as a legend whose legacy is now fixed in place. But when I think of what he actually taught me, it's not a list of accomplishments. It's a way of being, a set of values you can carry into your own life, regardless of whether you ever design a single important building. His real legacy to me is this: stay open, stay restless, stay human. That's the kind of inheritance that can't be archived. It can only be lived. The mirror and the mask. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had been designing like I was being watched. Every gesture, every diagram, every narrative, I curated it for the imaginary gaze of a critic, not just in studio, but in my own mind, as if I needed every idea to be defensible, elegant, correct. It wasn't architecture, it was performance. That voice in my head, the one that whispered, "Is this good enough?" never left the room, until I started listening to another voice, quieter, less confident, but more real. The one that asked, "What matters to you?" That shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like waking up in someone else's clothes and realizing they'd never fit. What Gehry taught me in his refusal to wear the accepted mask was that architecture is not meant to be a disguise. It's meant to be a mirror, a way of seeing yourself more clearly, not to glorify, but to understand. And the best mirrors don't reflect the surface, they reveal what's underneath. Time is texture. We like to think of architecture in permanence, buildings that last, legacies that endure, monuments frozen in stone. But that's never how Gehry seemed to treat time. He treated it more like a collaborator, something flexible, fluid, willing to interrupt the process and be part of it. That changed the way I thought about the timeline of a project, not as a straight line with a deadline at the end, but as a spiral, sometimes circling forward, sometimes looping back. From Gehry, I learned to respect slowness, to let ideas sit, to revisit abandoned sketches without shame. I even started keeping a failed concepts drawer, not as a graveyard, but as a garden. Because time doesn't just pass, it seasons things. I stopped rushing to finish. I started waiting to understand, and I learned something important. A rushed design may meet the brief, but a patient one might meet the soul. Ego interrupted. I used to think being an architect meant always being the smartest person in the room, that you had to command the table, hold the vision, defend the idea until everyone else gave in. But Gehry never seemed to lead with ego. He led with vulnerability. He asked questions. He laughed at himself. He let other voices in, and that terrified me. Because deep down, I believed that if I didn't control everything, I'd be exposed as a fraud. But watching Gehry admit his own not knowing with such ease made me rethink the whole concept of authority. It made me see that leadership doesn't come from certainty. It comes from listening, from creating a space where others feel brave enough to care. I started inviting collaborators earlier. I stopped pretending to have all the answers in front of clients. I even apologized once for pushing an idea too hard, and something amazing happened. The work got better. Not just technically, spiritually. Material as language. I used to pick materials like a checklist: durable, sustainable, affordable, appropriate. But I never listened to them. Gehry did. He let material speak. He let it push back, resist, warp the idea until it became something new. That taught me to approach material not as a tool, but as a co-author. I started asking, what do you want to do? What story do you carry? What memory do you hold? Sometimes it was the grain in a piece of reclaimed wood. Sometimes it was the shimmer of daylight across a brushed surface. Sometimes it was the soft crumble of handmade brick in my hand. Those materials taught me to slow down, to stop treating them like servants to the form and start seeing them as sources of wisdom. Because material isn't passive, it's alive. The space between things. There's a moment I return to often. Not a building, but a pause. I was walking through a project site late at night, just before construction began. It was empty, raw, just outlines, tape, dust. But something about the silence of the place struck me, the way the space held its breath. That's when I understood something Gehry had always known. Architecture happens in the spaces between light and shadow, between walls and words, between people and silence. We're so focused on form, on mass, on volume, on finish, that we forget the air is part of the architecture too. The way a space makes you feel when you're inside it, that's not just a consequence. It's the whole point, and it can't be drawn, it can only be felt. Gehry chased those feelings, not because they were functional, but because they were true. Resistance as fuel. There's a kind of architecture that seeks approval, and then there's the kind that seeks truth, even if it offends. Gehry never built to please. He built to speak. And that gave me the courage to stop apologizing for ideas that didn't fit the mold. It helped me reframe resistance, not as opposition, but as evidence that I was trying something new. I started noticing where the pushback came from. When people were confused, unsettled, or even a little angry, it often meant I had touched something real. Of course, not all resistance is a sign you're on the right path, but some of it is. And Gehry taught me how to listen for that difference. He taught me that if you're not upsetting someone, you're probably not changing anything. What is architecture still? I ask myself that question more now, not less. And I no longer expect an answer, because Gehry showed me that the question itself is sacred, that asking it again and again from different angles in different seasons of your life is what keeps the practice alive. Some days, I think architecture is a way of holding grief. Some days, it's a way of catching light. Some days, it's just an excuse to talk to strangers about beauty. But always, it's a way of paying attention, a form of love disguised as labor. And every time I ask, what is architecture? I hear Gehry somewhere in the back of my mind, smiling, shrugging, and saying, I'm still figuring it out. Me too. The ghost in the drafting room. There's something we don't talk about enough in architecture. The haunting. Every time I start a new project, I feel it, that ghost of a place that doesn't exist yet. It hovers just beyond comprehension, flickering in sketches, whispering through model fragments, surfacing in dreams. It's not a finished form. It's a presence, a feeling, a smell sometimes, a memory that hasn't happened yet. Gehry taught me to trust that ghost. He knew that what we build begins long before drawings and lingers long after occupancy. That architecture isn't just physical, it's psychological, emotional, even spiritual. Sometimes I think of a building not as a thing I create, but as a message I overheard, a trace of something timeless trying to pass through. It's not always clear who it's for. Sometimes it's for the people. Sometimes it's for the land. Sometimes it's just for a moment that needs to be marked. But always it's for something larger than me. The architect's heartbeat. There are days I forget why I do this, when the budgets get slashed, when the site floods, when the client ghosts, when the community protests, when the render doesn't reflect the pain it took to make the plan work. On those days, I want to quit. Not because I don't love it, but because loving it hurts. But then something small happens. I walk into a finished space and see a kid dancing in the corner where the light fell just right. Or someone runs their fingers along a wall I almost didn't include, and they smile without knowing why. Those moments bring me back. Gehry taught me to hold on to them, not the headlines or the accolades, but the human moments, the heartbeat. He never reduced architecture to a profession. For him, it was a way of feeling alive and helping others feel it too. That's the only reason I'm still here. Memory in the material. One summer, years ago, I revisited a small structure I had designed early in my career. It was nothing ambitious, just a modest intervention. I had nearly forgotten it. But when I arrived, I noticed something strange. The place felt different, as if it had grown a soul while I was away. The corners were softer now, the colors faded but warmer. People had moved through it, left marks, scratches, stories, sounds. It reminded me that architecture doesn't end at completion, it begins. We design for the present, but we build for the future's memory. Gehry's work, his process, his wildness, his openness, taught me that buildings aren't just objects. They're vessels. They carry the memory of the hands that built them, the minds that imagined them, the bodies that passed through them. And in time, they become part of who we are, even when we forget who made them. The silence after sound. Every architect lives with two kinds of silence. The first is the silence before the idea comes, the blank page, the stillness of not knowing. That one is terrifying, but full of promise. The second is the silence after the work is done. That silence is harder. It's the one that asks, did it matter? Gehry made peace with that silence. He didn't chase legacy, he chased sincerity. He didn't ask whether the work would be remembered, he asked whether it was true to the moment it was made. That changed me. I stopped worrying about whether my name would endure. I started asking whether the space would, whether the feeling would, whether something invisible would linger in the air long after the drawings had yellowed and the concrete had cracked. That kind of architecture doesn't shout. It hums, and its silence speaks. The cost of wonder. There's something Gehry knew, deep in his bones, that I'm only just beginning to understand. To chase wonder is to accept pain, to follow curiosity without a map, to be laughed at, to fail publicly, to push past what's been done, to make mistakes in front of people who keep receipts, to fight, gently or otherwise, for something no one else can see yet. It's exhausting, it's exhilarating, it's lonely, and it's holy. Gehry bore that cost with a kind of quiet bravery, and through him I've learned that the cost is not the price of success, it's the price of being honest. I still pay that price, sometimes unwillingly, but I pay it with love. Architecture is a verb. I used to think architecture was a noun, a thing, a fixed product. Now I know better. Architecture is a verb, a doing, a becoming, a changing of the conditions around us and inside us. You don't make architecture, you practice it, you ask it, you move through it, and if you're lucky, it moves through you. Gehry embodied that motion, that refusal to calcify. He kept becoming, and in that endless becoming, he gave me and thousands of others permission to keep unfolding. No final style, no conclusive theory, just an open hand, a tilted head, and a question. The last sketch is never final. I wonder sometimes what Gehry is thinking about these days. Does he still sketch in the morning? Still curse at models that misbehave? Still wonder if the next idea will come? I hope so. I hope he still feels the thrill of not knowing, the ache of wanting to get it right, the joy of being surprised. Because those things never go away. Not if you're truly alive to the work. And when my own hands tremble one day, too old to draft or draw or direct, I hope I still have the courage to ask, what is architecture? And I hope I can smile like he did and say, I'm still figuring it out. An open door. I often think of architecture now not as a structure, but as an act of love. A way to say, here, I made this for you, step inside. It's a door you leave open, a room you let others shape. A promise that someone, somewhere, cared enough to imagine a different way of living. Gehry taught me that, not in words, but in practice. In the way he let his questions breathe. In the way he invited the absurd, the poetic, the imperfect into the room. And in the way he never, not once, closed the door on mystery. Still becoming. So what is architecture? It's the light through a window you didn't plan. It's the sound of someone humming in a stairwell. It's the feeling you get in a space that wasn't made to impress, but to belong. It's risk. It's grief. It's a line you draw and then erase. It's memory, and hope, and failure, and love. It's everything you can't explain, written in everything you can touch. It's the question you keep asking, even when the world tells you to settle. It's the courage to say, I don't know, but I want to know. And that wanting, that ache, that chase, that restless love is the only answer I've ever needed. Just like Gehry, I'm still figuring it out, and I hope I never stop.